Good evening, everyone. I know we're all very excited. I can feel it in the room. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens, and I am just delighted to welcome you this evening, even though it is our final lecture for Perfume and Seduction. And I'm especially glad to welcome those in simulcast. So we have quite a crowd today. Of course, you know what I'm going to say next. Before we get started, please silence anything that, goes beep or whatever. So tonight, we send Perfume and Seduction off in style. We are going to be focusing on the incredible world of René Lalique and the golden age of perfumery. So you have just over 3 weeks left to go back and experience Perfume and Seduction one more time and come back and take another close look yourself, because they really do reward very close looking, and bring a friend. So make sure everybody sees this gorgeous exhibition before it closes. But when one door closes, another opens. So on Tuesday, June 4th, we will celebrate the opening of Mid-Century Master, the photography of Alfred Eisenstadt, with our black and white gala. Since, of course, the photographs are mostly black and white, we thought it would be fun to do a black and white gala. Sponsorships and tickets are still available. There are only a few left, but if you would love to come, we would love to have you. So it's a starlit dinner on the Lunar Lawn, and it's really very, very special. So I encourage you to think about experiencing it. Individual sponsorships are $1,000 and a wonderful way to support Hillwood. Regular tickets are $500. So. Of course, the gala is not your only opportunity to have dinner at Hillwood this summer. You've been hearing me talk about the new Dinner Time documentary series we're going to have that profiles legendary photographers of about the last half century. So you can spend a lovely evening in the garden and have a full-service meal in the cafe, and then head indoors for these really great films. So I've mentioned on June 18th, we'll show Harry Benson Shoot First. Eisenstadt said that Harry Benson's charming photography style is very similar to his own. And he took all of those iconic photographs of the Beatles when they first came for on the Ed Sullivan Show, and among many, many other things. And on July 10th, you can see one of my very favorite films, which is Bill Cunningham, New York. And many of you know that, of course, the New York Times has not been the same since Bill has been gone. And we'll wrap up the series on July 31st by looking at Annie Leibovitz. Yes, and so there's plenty of information about all of the films on our website, and you can purchase tickets and book your reservation in the cafe. So I hope to see all of you at some point during the summer. And please help us spread the word, since this is a completely new program. We've never done this before. We've never had the cafe available in the evening for dinner. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our charming speaker. Nicholas Dawes is a decorative arts professional and considered the United States' leading expert on René Lalique. He brings it's hard to imagine, but he brings 40 years of experience in the art and auction business. He's a child, really, mainly as a dealer in Lalique, but also as an auctioneer and department head at Phillips, Sotheby's, and currently at Heritage Auctions in New York. He's the author of 4 standard works on decorative arts, including Lalique Glass, and scores of articles. Nick lectures widely on a variety of subjects and has been an adjunct professor at Parsons, the New School for Design, since 1984. He's also taught at NYU, Columbia Business School, and the Bard Graduate Center. In 1989, he curated the pioneering exhibition Lalique, A Century of Glass for the Modern World, which toured museums for several years. Nick may be familiar to you as a regular appraiser for Antiques Roadshow on PBS, where he has appeared since the first season in 1996. And you really need to go to the website because there's a photograph of Nick in 1996 and there's a more recent photograph. I'm telling you, he hasn't changed a bit, has not changed a bit. But he's been appraising ceramics, silver, and glass. I mean, he really does it all. In 2010, he donated his comprehensive archive of Lalique images to the Corning Museum of Glass. So please join me in welcoming Nicholas Dawes.
Thank you, Kate. I'd like to thank Kate and all of the excellent staff here at Hillwood for inviting me and making me feel so welcome. And of course, all of you for coming. A special thanks to my friend Rebecca Tillis, who invited me some months ago, and we were talking about what I should talk about. And I thought it over, and I could show you lots of pictures of René Lalique's perfume bottles. There are many of them. But I thought that might be a little bit de trop, as they say in French. So let's talk about René Lalique and his fuller life, and lead up to his adventures with perfumery. He is, it would be an understatement, I think, to call René Lalique a Renaissance man, although he has been termed that way. He was born in 1860, died in 1945, and if you know anything of the history of art, you know this is the critical period in the evolution of what we call the modern movement. Throughout René Lalique's lifetime, we go from academic painting in the fine art to, well, by 1945 you have, Jackson Pollock dripping house paint onto a canvas from above. All bets are off, and there's a series of developments where barriers are broken in the fine arts, taking us from academic realism through Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and Fauvism and Cubism, and ultimately to abstract expressionism. And there's a parallel series of developments in the decorative arts. And René Lalique is very much a protagonist in this. He is always on the front line. And to a large extent, you can judge a great artist or a great designer by their constant search to do something different. If they're not satisfied, they're progressive. And of course, you're only as good as your last output. So this is commercially, you might say, somewhat risky, but it's a great measure. If you want to compare him with anyone, it's difficult, but there are two characters in the history of design and decorative art that I like to mention. One is Josiah Wedgwood I, who had an equally long and arguably equally prolific and influential life and output a century before René Lalique. And the other is Frank Lloyd Wright, who was more or less a contemporary of Lalique. And if you know something of his time, he was always doing something different too. But let's move on. Let's look at this, and I promise there will be perfume bottles, believe me. René Lalique, we know the name Lalique, of course, today, largely speaking, in the realm of glass. The company that he founded 130 years ago is still very active and makes just about exclusively glass. But René Lalique didn't start manufacturing and designing glass on a commercial scale until he was about 50. Glassmaking is very much a second career for him, which I've always thought, if anyone's about 50, is very encouraging, considering, and you think, what can I do next? Well, he's left us over 3,000 magnificent designs in glass, about 10% of which, by the way, are perfume bottles, so there's no shortage of pictures of them if you really want me to show them to you. But This, as I say, was his second career. His primary first career was as a jeweler. By the time he was 40, he was arguably the most fashionable, perhaps the most successful jeweler in the world from his atelier in Paris. This piece is, to me, it sums up everything that René Lalique could do that no one else could. It is a hair ornament modeled as a pair of swallows. It's made of horn, a naturalistic material, something he liked to do. He favored materials that were non-precious. He made jewelry out of horn constantly. He preferred aluminum in many cases over gold or silver. He rarely used precious jewels or even precious metals. But look what he's done here. He has captured this pair of swallows in mid-flight. It's a millisecond of time, but perhaps the most beautiful millisecond you could imagine as two swallows interact. No one else could capture that except a photographer. And by the way, what Kate has just said about what's in store for you over the next 3 or 4 months, you have to go to all that. It's going to be spectacular. René Lalique was a photographer too, and I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But he's captured this moment as only a photographer could, but he's captured it permanently in horn. Secondly, hair ornaments of this period, it's from 1900, are not uncommon. It was a fashionable thing for ladies to wear. And they're typically decorative on the top. Then they have 2 prongs that come down that you stick into your hair. Nobody except Lalique made the prongs part of the design. It's typically a metal prong and then on top there's flowers or something. What has he done? He has elongated in what I call a manneristic way the 2 extended wings of these things. It makes them more elegant, but at the same time it makes them superbly practical. This is brilliant in the realm of design thinking. Horn has a tendency, as ivory and other organic materials does, to kind of return to its original shape. It'll bend. So what's he done? He's strengthened it with a little piece of silver, piece of metal, which is made strong enough. It's just attached on the top there. But it simulates that little piece of twig, you know, that a swallow or a bird is carrying as it's building a nest at this time of the year. So this is a practical thing. It's what they call in decorative art a rest, but it's done so superbly. This is Lalique at his absolute best. And he carries this, he's 40 years old now, he carries this attention to design. And by the way, he's capable of doing all this himself. He can make this because he's learned every aspect of the jeweler's craft. He carries this throughout his entire career. And you can find this sort of detail in his work that you cannot find anywhere else. Here he is then, portrayed at the pinnacle, in fact, of both his careers. On my right, it's a photograph of him in his Paris atelier probably in 1902. He's basking in the successes of the Great Paris Exhibition of 1900, the Centennial Exposition, for which he was really the star of the show. And as I say, he's 40, 41 here. He could very happily have lived the rest of his life as an elegant, successful Parisian jeweler. Not a bad life, but no, he wants to do something else. The second portrait, painted by his daughter, Suzanne Lalique, in 1926, shows him in his little atelier in Alsace, adjacent to the glassworks that he had built there 5 years earlier. And he's the same guy, looks a little older, don't we all? And he's wearing glasses. And there is a general belief that, it's certainly something I believe, that one reason that he left jewelry and moved into working on a larger scale was, as many people as happens, many people in their 40s and 50s, his eyesight started to go. And it's more difficult to work with the eye of a jeweler under those circumstances. But he says himself, around 1900, shortly after the Paris exhibition, he talks about how people are beginning to copy him and how this is upsetting him and how he's going to start doing different things, which indeed he does. In both portraits, however, he's doing what I believe he did most of in his life, and I also believe, arguably, he did best. He's drawing. I read some years ago, when it came out, a little paperback book that was a series of letters that he had written mostly in the late 1890s up to about 1905, which had been discovered and published by the Musée d'Orsay. And it's letters that René Lalique wrote to and from his mistress at the time largely, and also between various friends, including Auguste Rodin. But in a lot of the letters, several of them, he says to his girlfriend in Paris, he says, because he's away, he's in London or something, he says, I have to go now because I've got to draw that camellia that's outside the window or something like that, you know. Every day he has to draw something. And he was brilliant at it. The drawings of René Lalique, if you get a chance to see them, and you can see them in the Lalique Museum in Alsace, are just fantastic. His daughter Suzanne, by the way, arguably inherited the talent. She worked briefly for the Lalique company. She did design some vases and decoration of vases in 1926, 27, but not much. She decorated porcelain. She was married to a member of the Avilland family in Limoges and decorated Avilland porcelain. Here are people picking roses in Grasse. And so let's talk a little about perfume. They could almost be picking grapes, I think, you know, in the région just to the right of Grasse here. And for much of its time, perfume was made very similarly to the way wine is manufactured, you might say. You know, the perfume bottles in the exhibit here at Hillwood are almost entirely 18th or early 19th century, and they were made for a relatively wealthy group of people. And there's always been expensive perfume, just as there's always been expensive wine. And there was a time when there really was only expensive perfume, and perfume was made rather as wine is, in an organic way, and each year it was kind of different, and you relied on what they picked that year and how they processed it to make the fragrance. The kind of fragrance that filled the bottles you see upstairs and in the house here and in the dacha were filled with that sort of stuff. It wasn't really until René Lalique's time, a little over a century ago, that perfume became an industry, rather like wine has become an industry, whereby it can be reliably manufactured every year. And you can make the same formulaic perfume each year and rely on it. The Chanel number 5 you buy today should be the same as the one that Coco Chanel used, because it's the same thing. Even though it's made from an organic product, you think about that. The wine that you get today isn't. They haven't quite got to that yet. And also, there's sort of always been a cheap wine as well as an expensive wine, but it wasn't really until René Lalique's time that there became a cheap perfume. And I hate to use the word cheap, but let's say an affordable perfume. And we'll see what I mean as the story unfolds. Lalique loved flora and fauna of all sorts. He brought it into his atelier and modeled from it. He did bring in some photographs, he did bring some specimens, but as you know, flowers don't last very long. And if you need to use it as a model, so what he would do is he would cast it in bronze. Not he, but his brother-in-law, a guy called Auguste Ledru, who was a sculptor. His brother and his father-in-law, in fact, at the time, both worked alongside him to some degree from about 1897, 8, 9, something like that, into the early years of the 20th century. And these plaques that were discovered about 15 years ago in the estate of Marie-Claude Lalique were cast by Dawes, and we think just used in the atelier as kind of models that Lalique could work from. And much of his jewelry was in the form of naturalistic flora, pansies. He did visit the Jardin Botanique in Paris, we know that, and he did pay some attention to what you might call exotic flora, in the same way that Mrs. Post did here, growing her various exotic flowers. And this was very much a passion at the time among the French to be, taken by exotic flora. But René Lalique was not an exotic guy. It was the other people who did that, the sort of the more romantic French designers who were fully into the Art Nouveau movement. To me, there's something more Baudelarian about René Lalique, and he was indeed a poet. There are a number of poets by him that exist, mostly written in the 1880s and even earlier. And so he could almost be considered an extension of the French Romantic poet movement. He was doing it sort of in real time. Sarah Bernhardt and a number of other actresses of the time were taken with Lalique and became his clients by the middle of the 1890s. And this was hugely successful for him. She was, we think about international superstars today. She was bigger than anybody in her day. And of course, in 1900, the Parisian stage was the world's stage, and there was no electronic entertainment of any sort. So if you wanted to see a great show, you went to Paris. You went to Paris for a lot of things. You went from here to Paris to buy the best gowns and the latest fashions and to see the latest shows in 1900 and throughout the Belle Époque. But this kind of thing, this enormous orchid, is unusual for Lalique. It's the kind of thing that he made largely for actresses, kind of stage jewelry. It's larger than life. It's the sort of thing that would look good, to a 5-foot-tall young lady on stage. But where Lalique really found his passion was among what you might call the lesser flora. He didn't see any difference in the aesthetics between flowers, even exotic flowers, and what we would call weeds. He loved the dandelion, the pissenlit, and here's a drawing of his, just a naturalistic drawing, but it's not really a drawing of a naturalistic dandelion. It's a drawing for something. Here's a hat pin by him from 1900, gold and glass. By this time, he was already casting in glass, small way. You can cast glass in a small way, basically in a kitchen, in a small furnace, in a very small controlled environment that he had in his atelier. He loved weeds. And why not? He also loved moths. He loved the phalène, or as the French call them, the Papillon de Nuit, the night butterflies, which again is very Baudelarian. And to me, the moth is to the butterfly as the weed is to the flower. He didn't see the difference. He lived in this atelier in Paris. He had his apartment on the top. You can go there today. You can't get in, but you can see the doors. I'll show you pictures in a moment. He lived on the top floor. And I've been in that apartment. And in the back, there are windows. And at night, what happens? The moths come up. You've seen this. And they come up and they splat on the window. And I'm confident that Lalique saw this. And as we've all seen it. And when you think about it, is there anything more spectacular than that? That display. So he took it and he went with it. He drew it, he made jewelry out of it, and he made objects out of it. here he is with his first wife, and she was wealthy. He wasn't. His father had died young. His mother arranged a marriage, and she brought with her, among other things, this house. It was a small, what you might call a small chateau, in just outside Paris, near the town of Rambouillet, in the town called a little place called Clairefontaine. And I've been there. It's a superb little corner of sort of forgotten France. If you've ever read Alain Fournier, it is the lost domain, you know. And he spent a good deal of his time there going back and forth between Clairefontaine and his Paris studios. And he took photographs there. He was, as say, a photographer. This is in the 1890s, so there was, to a certain extent, he's pioneering as a photographer. But there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs by Lalique that exist, mostly things like this, pictures of the garden flora and fauna like these swans, that he then took into the studio and made into something. This is a drawing that I bought actually at an auction in Paris about 20 years ago, and I really didn't know what it was. I thought it was what they call a collier de chien, you know, like a dog collar. And then I found this ring, which was shown at the Paris exhibition of 1900. And of course, that's the way he would do it. He would draw and give his drawings to his artisans and say this, you know, he would make notes on them. This is how you make it. And you may know the Swans from Lalique, which they still make. I believe this is Rene Lalique's last design. It was officially, according to the record books, designed in 1945. He died in 1945, just 3 days, by the way, after the official end of hostilities of World War II. But this was not produced until after the war, as you would expect. But to me, the pair of swans on the Mirror Plateau is good enough to be from Rene Lalique's hand, and I think it's his legacy is lasting for us, really. Glass and jewelry. But another photograph by Lalique with these extraordinary trees that are in that chateau grounds. He sees the trees, and of course, being Lalique and being a bit Baudelairean, he sees a nymph in the top, and he takes this nymph throughout his entire career. We see it in his jewelry. Here's the drawing from it. You see it's annotated, and it says, you know, this is what you do, and this color here, and this and that and that. And he does it on certain scales, and his drawings are just spectacular. This nymph appears 3 feet tall on the stand that Lalique showed his jewelry at in 1900. This is at the Universal Exhibition in the Grand Palais, and there's an image of it. And Lalique has thought about, how do I show my jewelry? You know, he's trying to sell his jewelry. He's not just showing off. So he wants people to look at it and fall in love with it and buy it. And if you've ever been to a jewelry exhibition, you spend a lot of the time kind of with your head bent over, looking into a showcase. That's no good. So what did Lalique do? He makes these amazing nymphs, the wings of which are made of a very fine mesh, a very fine silk mesh, and then the jewelry is hung on it. So it's kind of hanging there, you know, in this diaphanous wing. It's just spectacularly beautiful. And again, he's thought of all this. And it works. I was talking with Rebecca earlier about whether Mrs. Post would ever have crossed paths with Rene Lalique. And it's quite possible that she was at this exhibition when she would have been 13 years old. Her father was there, we know, and as were 50 million other people, by the way. It was an enormously successful event. And maybe she did, and it's nice to think romantically that maybe she did walk past this display, and maybe she did see a gentleman with a mustache smiling at her in the back. But here's a guy who's a jeweler making a spectacularly beautiful 4 foot tall bronze, you know? He's able to work on any scale. Again, the mark of a great designer. He was at the time in 1900 somewhat under the influence of the gentleman on the right. This is Henri Veuve, who was a little older than him, who was a jeweler, somewhat his mentor. If you look at other slides of the 1900 Paris exhibition, you'll see Henri Veuve's stand full of his jewelry right next door to René Lalique's. But Lalique, by that point, had overtaken Veuve in terms of being popular, chic, successful. That's La Maison d'Art Nouveau next to it, operated by Siegfried Bing, who was also somewhat of a mentor for René Lalique. Lalique showed some of his works in La Maison d'Art Nouveau and sold it there before he opened his own gallery. Now, both of these guys, Veuve and Bing, were huge collectors of Japanese art. Woodblock prints primarily, and objects. And again, if you know the history of art, you'll know how the influence of woodblock print on people like Lautrec and the post-impressionists in particular, and the impressionists. But there was also a direct effect here on decorative art, particularly on René Lalique. Another photograph. This is the alley of trees going up to the Chateau de Fontaine in winter. He loved pine cones. This is his house in Paris, which, again, he's a jeweler. He designs the entire facade of a house, so he becomes an architect, working from the minute scale to the largest possible. Has anyone been outside this house? You can wander right up to it. It's at 40 Cours la Reine in Paris, near the Trocadero. And it's the whole thing, it's if you look closely, it's actually signed. There's a big R Lalique next to the doorway. But these doors, which are still there, installed in 1902, are glass. They're cast in glass. And it's rather like a huge jewel in many ways. And typically of Lalique, the pattern, in this case the pine branches, extend through the glass door and into the surround, which is made of a kind of advanced cement at the time called béton coigné. So he's got these mix of materials, which again, no one else did, and no one else made glass panels that were decorative like that. He couldn't make them. He didn't have a glassworks. This is 1902. We haven't really started his career as a glassmaker. We think he had them made at a place called Saint-Gobain, where another of his mentors, a guy called Jules-Henri Vaux, who was the director there at the time, operated the works. But we're not entirely sure where these were made. But they're still there, great testament to his ability, and you can go and see them. And I say he lived up there on the top floor. And I've been in there. It hasn't changed much since he lived there, actually. And he died there in 1945. He's buried, by the way, in Père Lachaise, which is always worth a visit. And if you go and see René Lalique, just a few steps away is the grave of Sarah Bernard, which is constantly covered with fresh flowers. So he's finished with the 1900 exhibition. He's basically looking for new challenges, but he has to make a living. His clients are all essentially jewelry people from all over Europe. Americans, wealthy Americans, left, right, and center, are going to Paris, as I say, to buy their fashion and whatever, and they're buying Lalique. Not Mrs. Post. She was a little too young at that point, and she, as you can see, focused more, as a great many wealthy Americans did, on the earlier taste, the ancien regime of France, and in her case, 18th century, pre-Tsarist at least, or pre-revolutionary Russian, and so on and so forth. This was very typical too. Lalique was avant-garde for many people, but good enough that once you got it, you were hooked, and you would keep going with it. So what did he do? He didn't give up jewelry. He kept making jewelry, but he started making other things, accessories. These are bags. There's a drawing for one there, and a bag made in leather and silver, essentially. From about 1902, 3, 4, he started working at a larger scale, making metal and glass objects, chalices, for instance. The one on the right with the pine cones, from about 1902, 1903, was made in series. He made many of these. We think perhaps as many as 40 or 50 of them. So he starts also mass producing, you might say, which is a hallmark of René Lalique's approach to glass making a little later on. Here he is, in about 1905, painted by, we don't know, so we think it's someone in his studio in a kind of caricature, and evidence that, yes, he loved to bring creatures into his atelier, you know. He was fascinated by these little creatures. Again, the uglier the better, actually. He loved serpents and wasps and frogs and toads and stuff like that. He had a big stuffed serpent on his desk. But look what he could do with them, you know. Here's another hair ornament, and that's a moonstone. And imagine you're wearing that at the Opera House in 1905, walking around with that sticking out of your hair. And the light from the gas lighting would just pick up that and just bring it all to life, you know. What a fantastic thing. Nobody else could do this. You know, there were other great jewelers at the time making wonderful things. Nobody comes close to Lalique in terms of the life and the ability and the overall quality of his work. Loved horn. This is a hair comb. That's a drawing. You know, that's not an object. That's a drawing by René Lalique for a comb. It's very good. And he falls in love with glass. He starts falling in love with glass fairly early. By the late 1890s, he's making little bits of glass for bits of jewelry. He's casting it. He realizes that with a cast, with a mold, you know, you can make the one element and then make it over and over again. And you just keep making them. This is great. So he creates things like this. It's what you'd call a pectoral ornament. Great thing for wearing right here, you know. Very much in your face this is. Jewelry got very large by this time, partly through the influence of people like Sarah Bernhardt and wearing theatrical jewelry on stage. But he loved glass. And again, these are not the most attractive fish. He liked the uglier fish. He was fine with that. No problem. He also likes symmetry. And if you want to pinpoint one element in the work of René Lalique that's consistent and not unique to him, but entirely characteristic, and what distinguishes him arguably from any other contemporary designer, particularly in jewelry and also in glass, it's his use of symmetry, his very subtle use of symmetry in many cases. This is an entirely symmetrical object, but it's still an Art Nouveau object. And when anyone talks to you about Art Nouveau, they tell you how organic it is and how languid it is and all this. It isn't all like that. Lalique didn't go for that. They also tell you how it's all symbolic, and it isn't. Lalique didn't go for that either. Lalique was what the French call very raffiné. He was very correct. He was very sophisticated man with very strong ideas, extremely well informed. Some of the Art Nouveau people, particularly those a little younger, were much looser, basically hippies living in France and entranced by French Romanticism and Baudelaire, mixed with a little bit of absinthe and all that. and a good deal of French symbolism comes out of that kind of cafe society. He wasn't part of that. Here he is Portrayed again, in this case by his friend Théodore Rivière in bronze in about 1903. Rivière made these bronze portraits of his friends, I think. This one's inscribed "À mon ami Lalique." And he also, if you know the work of Rivière, he also made bronze casts of World War I soldiers, the French poilus, on the front, on the Western Front in 1917. And they're some of the finest World War I bronzes you'll ever see. And I've seen a number of these bronze portraits, which are about this tall. There's one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, actually, on permanent view. And they're all sort of notable friends of his, mostly in the arts. And they're all portrayed in what you might call their Sunday best. You know, they've all got a beautiful cravat on, and superb frock coat and all that. Not Lalique. And I think he asked to be portrayed this way. He's portrayed wearing the smock of what you might call an ouvrier, an ordinary worker. And to me, that's the way he knew that this is a permanent thing. You get cast in bronze, it doesn't go away. And he's saying, and I think he said to Rivière, okay, you're going to do me? I don't want to be like that guy. I want to be the way I look every day. And this is it. They met regularly, he and Rivière, together with other members of French artistic society. The painter Georges Clairin was central to that little cadre of people, and they would meet regularly and have dinners at René Lalique's house, the one we just saw. The playwright Edmond Rostand was there too. And imagine that dinner, imagine those guys, they're all more or less the same age and friendly and sort of well connected, but highly sophisticated. It was almost like, you know, the kind of sophisticated people who met a century earlier in those clubs and societies. Here's a drawing for a hand mirror. Again, the kind of thing that, here's the mirror itself, the kind of thing that Lalique was making in his very early works in glass. It's really a beautiful object designed to appeal to the jewellery client. And I could see Mrs. Post having this on her, you know, on her poudreuse. It's good enough for anyone, this is. It's actually, this particular one bears a crown. It was made for the royal family of Sweden. Swallows, again, one of his all-time popular images. The swallow, of course, is the ultimate symbol of elegance in many ways, and like all birds, it's beautifully symmetrical. And René Lalique understood and depicted this very well. And I promised there would be perfume bottles, and here we go. It's about this time, we're about 1905 now, when René Lalique first makes perfume bottles. Now, some people will tell you that they were made as early as the 1890s, and it's quite possible that some of them were. But essentially, it's not until the early years of the 20th century that René Lalique begins to pay attention to making an object purely in glass, and not just using glass as an element in something else. And his earliest work in that way really is in the form of perfume bottles. He was, after all, schooled in the old-fashioned way. He was schooled academically, you know, born in 1860. His formative years were spent in the academic manner, and he learned everything that a young artistic student should learn, including about the ancient world and the Renaissance and everything up to that. And to a large extent, his early work in glass like this has more to do with the ancient world than anything else. There were exhibits in the 1870s in Paris at the Louvre of ancient glass, something that the French kind of rediscovered. And again, if you know something of the history of French art glass, pâte de verre, and even cameo glass has a good deal to do with rediscovering the secrets of the ancient world, in those cases Egyptian and Roman glass. consecutively. But René Lalique saw these exhibits and was fascinated by the way the ancients did things, and set about rediscovering his own way. His work casting in metals had led him into the cire perdu, or the lost wax process, another ancient technique, which he applied very successfully and uniquely, really, to glass making. These two perfume bottles were made in the cire perdu technique, and they are really the earliest perfume bottles that René Lalique ever made. One of them, by the way, on the closest here, sold at auction quite recently and is the single most highest price paid for a Lalique perfume bottle, about $350,000. So people pay real attention and respect to these things. But they're not really designed to hold perfume. They were made as objects. They were made as an objet vertu, something that a jewelry client would fancy. The cire perdu glass casting process is something that he began to experiment with more and more. Again, you can make these things in relatively rudimentary conditions. You make cire perdu, which means lost wax in French, by first of all carving the object you want to create. In this case, it's a hanging light bulb out of wax, which René Lalique did himself. You then encase that into plaster of Paris, which kind of molds all around it, and the wax is inside this block, and then you drill a hole into it and you steam into that, and that steam melts the wax, which runs off, hence the term lost wax. And you've got this plaster block with a void inside it, which you can then fill with glass. You can either blow it in, or in this case you pour it in, and it sets and anneals and cools down, and then you break away the mold, and the result is this, if you're lucky and if you're good at it. And by definition, each piece is unique. You know, you make one piece per mold. And you can make, as you can see in this sort of prunus blossom, you can make molded design that's severely undercut, that you can't possibly do through any conventional molding technique. And René Lalique loved this. But, as I said earlier, he was primarily interested in mass production. So this doesn't go with mass production. He did make cire perdu castings through his life, about 350 of them, but they were largely made as kind of showpieces, artists' secrets, he called them. So this is the Place Vendome, which if you've been to Paris, I'm sure you've been to, and the Place Vendome looks much the same today, by the way, as it did in Louis XV's time. But it was, at the time, and this is 1905 now, the center of the French luxury industry, essentially, as it still is today. If you wander around there today, you can spend a lot of money in a very short time, believe me. René Lalique opened his first gallery there, essentially, in 1905, selling jewelry and a few objets. And in 1907 or 8, a young Corsican perfume maker called Francois Coty moved in next door. This is a view from inside Coty's store. You can see the name over on the awning there. And Francois Coty was well, let's put it this way. He came to Paris with huge ambitions. He was born on the island of Corsica. He was about 5 foot nothing, and he believed that he was descended directly from Napoleon Bonaparte, which all Corsicans do, by the way. But he had some reason for this, and like Napoleon, a century earlier, he came to Paris with big ambitions, and like Napoleon, he built an empire. But Coty's empire was an empire of perfume. It was enormous. It was arguably bigger than Napoleon's. And almost immediately, he commissioned his neighbor René Lalique, who was 15 years older, senior, as I say, raffiné, very, very highly respected, to help him design what he had created. By this time, Francois Coty had learned the perfume business. He'd worked in Grasse. He'd understood it all. He'd figured it out. He was a brilliant businessman. And he had essentially created the first, and again, I hate to use the word, cheap perfumes. They were not cheap in any sense of the word that we use today, but they were affordable for really the first time. They were not van ordinaire. They were very good indeed, but they were just marketable to a much wider, expanded audience. This is a very early plaque, which again came from that estate of Marie-Claude Lalique, and we assume it's quite sizable. It's about as big as a sort of book, and we assume it was a backdrop for something made by Lalique, probably as a unique thing, as early as 1908 or 9. Coty was he was not everyone's favorite. If he was living today, he would be to the extreme right of Madame Le Pen. He was, as the French say, extrême droite, and not everyone's favorite character. Ruthless and brilliant. He made an absolute fortune early in his life through his development of not just perfume but cosmetics in general. He managed to lose most of it through a series of divorces and mistresses and illegitimate children and goodness knows what, and the Great Depression didn't help. But he spent incredibly lavishly. He liked chateaux. He kind of collected them and would buy them and then do them up to, you know, he actually did great things by restoring several chateaux to their former glory and preserving them, and so on and so forth. But what Lalique originally did for him was not design bottles, but design labels. The one I show was made for Dawes, one of Coty's rivals, a little bit later. But these gold gilt pressed paper labels were really René Lalique's first foray into the world of fragrance. And you see them throughout the fragrance industry in the first 25 or 30 years of the 20th century. And René Lalique was really the first to consider this concept, make them gold, make them look fabulous, and make them extremely inexpensively. This is a René Lalique design. And you know, it's a tiny little thing. It's a little paper thing, but it's exquisite. Again, so Lalique, so you know. There's nymphs again, symmetry. Coty's Grande Armée was formed of young, attractive women who sold the product throughout his empire. By 1910, 12, he was in several cities, including New York City and London, which is really his first foray, and shortly after that in several other European capitals. And you could buy Coty fragrances on the street too. They had like wheelbarrow things that you could set up and you could buy from a cart. And he would, you know, he sold you a little bottle of fragrance, but he invented the presentation, where you could buy a little presentation box with powder and fragrance and eau de cologne and all this, all together, all of the same scent. Arguably, his biggest money maker was not even perfume, but face powder. That's Selfridges, by the way, on the right. About 1910, 12, and that's the Coty London showroom about the same time. What happens now is, of course, the First World War, and the war devastates Europe, 1914 to 1918, particularly the French. It's hard for us today to imagine, you know. The French lost about 1 in 22 of their male population in the First War, as did the British, as did the Germans. And most of them, of course, were about 18 or 20 years old. You know, if you go to the wall, you'll see the names of every American service person who lost their life in the Vietnam campaign. And it's about 55,000 names over a period of over 10 years. There were battles in the First World War, individual battles, when that many men were killed on one day. And the results of this are obviously war kind of punctuates our history, and it has enormous repercussions beyond the dreadful side. One of them, for Francois Coty and his empire, was a massive demand for perfume. The First World War brought millions of servicemen into France, and if they were lucky enough, they went to Paris. And many of them decided the thing to bring back to, wherever they were going, Iowa or Yorkshire or Australia, was perfume, French perfume. And this really began a tradition, actually, that servicemen still do, to bring perfume and cosmetics, French, back for their wives and sweethearts. So there was an enormous market for this readily available, beautifully packaged, inexpensive, good quality, reliable stuff that really Coty produced more than anyone else. After 1918 and through the 20s, arguably up until the Depression kind of changed things. Air-spun face powder, which Coty invented, shown here in a little box designed by René Lalique, was, like I say, perhaps his biggest moneymaker. Here's where Coty starts. This is a tester box showing his first fragrances, actually in chronological order. The first one there from 1904, La Rose Jacquemino. And then here's little testers of his first 6 fragrances, all designed, created before 1910. And there's a story, if you know anything, the history of Coty, that he wasn't selling his fragrances very well, and he walked into what was then the Magasin du Louvre, the Grand Magasin du Louvre, which is now that big building opposite the Louvre. It used to be the Louvre des Antiquaires. If you went antique shopping in Paris in the 80s and 90s and 2000, you went to the Louvre des Antiquaires. That used to be the Grand Magasin du Louvre, the great big department store on the bottom and the Hôtel du Louvre above. And the story is that Francois Coty walked in there and intentionally smashed a bottle of La Rose Jacquemino on the perfume counter, and all the women from all around flocked in and wanted to buy it. And that starts his career. The story, as far as I can tell, is apocryphal, but there it is. So here's a very early and very mundane-looking set of fragrances, really designed to be on a countertop for people to test, But what's the best part of it? Obviously, this plaque. This plaque here that René Lalique has added to this otherwise mundane box. This is a little thing on a countertop, and René Lalique has created this bronze plaque that is absolutely magnificent. The work in this is as good as anyone achieved from the Renaissance up. Superb quality work in just a tiny little thing. It's the eye and the ability of a jeweler creating this. And we still haven't seen any perfume bottles, but here it is. Okay? Here is what may be the best perfume bottle, commercial perfume bottle, in my opinion, that you will ever see. Les Fleurs, which means sort of the sort of warm hug and kiss, embrace thing. By René Lalique for Coty from 1909. It's 1909 when René Lalique really says, okay, I'll do it. I'll make the bottles for you as well as the labels. And in order to do this, I'll open a glassworks. And he opens a glassworks. He takes over an antiquated glassworks, a little outside Paris, and starts making, among other things, perfume bottles for Coty. But look at this. This shows the front and the back, by the way. Perfume Bottles by Lalique are almost always signed, and in a way that you can sort of see them. But the quality of the design and the execution, but at this point no one's made a decorative perfume bottle where the glass is decorative. The decorative element, the perfume bottles made before, the ones we just saw, by the way, were made by, these were made at the Baccarat factory. They were plain, you know, they looked like medicine bottles, and they'd have a sticker on them, a pretty sticker. But Rene Lalique said, no, we're going to make the bottle the thing. Exquisite thing. Here's some. This is Coty's. This is Coty's headquarters in New York. It was until very recently Henri Bendel. It's at Fifth Avenue and 55th Street, and the 3 stories of windows overlooking Fifth Avenue are by Rene Lalique. Here's a detail of it. The entire first floor here was clad with Rene Lalique glass when it was opened in 1913. This is what's left. I actually got involved in this about 25 years ago. It was going to be demolished by the Taubman company that owned the building, and we ended up preserving it through the Landmarks Commission in New York City, and they built a 60-story building behind it. But if you go to New York today, you can see the restored version of this. I say you can. The building's closed at the moment because Bendel just closed, so I don't know what's going to be in there next. But I hope you've seen it. And it's basically a huge perfume bottle, 3 stories high, that Rene Lalique has built for, using the same kind of glass technique that he used on his own building in Paris. Here's the old works at Cum-la-Ville, which closed eventually in the 1980s, in fact, but stopped making glass really in the 1930s. Humble beginnings for Rene Lalique. And I want to show you this drawing. This really is, I could give the whole lecture about this drawing. You know, they say that if you ever hear anyone talk about Art Nouveau and Art Deco, they say, well, Art Nouveau is like all organic and floppy, and Art Deco is all geometric and straight. Well, of course, it's not that simple. One of my books is called Art Deco, and I hope if you really want to understand it, you'll just read the introduction to that talks about what Art Deco really is. But if you look at this, here's a drawing of Lalique for a perfume bottle, and he's taken it's an aster, and he's drawn it here naturalistically, and then he said, well, let's play with it a bit, and he's drawn it geometrically. And this is about, I date this to 1909. Now, there was an artist by the name of Paul Iribe who worked for Paul Poiret, who created what we call today the Iribe rose, where he took a rose and he did effectively the same thing. He geometrically stylized it in a beautiful way. And Iribe said we should not sacrifice the rose on the altar of the machine. He was very concerned about just taking something as beautiful as a rose and kind of slicing it up and geometrically stylizing it and getting it wrong and making it ugly. And Lalique clearly got that too, before Iribe even did it. So what's happened here? What's happened here is Lalique has taken a design, thought about it, and then changed it. Now, who knows how long he did this? It could well have been, and I suspect it was, on the same day. So think about that. Let's say it's a matter of hours. Let's say give him a couple hours. In 2 hours, and in 6 centimeters on BFK Reeve parchment paper, he goes from Art Nouveau to Art Deco. This is an extremely important drawing, in my opinion. 1909, showing Lalique and his ability to think, to take a flower head, which is naturalistically symmetrical, by the way, and make it so. He did, by the way, produce this bottle and chose the naturalistic aster in the middle. You don't see many of them, but they do show up occasionally. I think he did that because the world wasn't quite ready for the other one yet. Later in his glassmaking career, here's a piece from 1927. He routinely used purely geometric, naturalistic forms and arranged them in what you might call an abstract pattern, geometric pattern. Like these are poppy heads, you see. But they look to all the world like just a sort of geometric cavity. But if you look closely, they are completely naturalistic flower heads that he's made into this exquisite sort of Art Deco design later on. But by this time, 1909, they're not quite ready for that, so he goes with that. 1912 is when René Lalique officially becomes a glassmaker, and he does it by having at his store on the Place Vendome an all-glass exhibition. And he sends to his clients a little invitation, which is this thing right here. It's a little glass medallion. It's sort of about 3 inches diameter. And you may have seen these if you collect Lalique. They reproduce them in recent years as holiday ornaments for Christmas trees. But on the back of the original, it says, "Please come to my exhibition in November 1912." It's a little, you get this in the mail just delivered to your door. Imagine you open the box and, oh, look at that, a little glass invitation from René Lalique, and it says, basically says, "I'm now a glassmaker." By the way, in the 1890s, he sent such an invitation inscribed on ivory to his jewelry clients. And in the 1920s, he sent one made of plastic. He was working in plastic by then. But this is a great little object. And in his first exhibition, by this time he'd had a glassworks for 3 years, and he's basically saying, that's it, jewelry, okay, I'll make some jewelry, I'll make glass jewelry, but I'm done with that. I'm going to make all glass now. There's a piece from his first exhibition, a rather ambitious vase with these sort of strange frogs populating the top. And a piece of cire perdu closest to me, vase with a frog on the cover. Love frogs. I suspect he saw them hopping about in that pond, with the swans on it. Here's another vase, very ambitious, large, big blue vase. And it's molded with cavities in it, and then in the cavities, he molded and cast other pieces of clear glass that he put inside them. And between the wall of the blue vessel and the inset, he puts some foil, some metallic foil. So the whole thing glows, He's done this he's done this in jewelry before, and so he's learned the technique. But here's a vase that's this big, with these, it's basically a huge jewel. And if you look at this perfume bottle, it dates from the same time. These are both 1912, 1911, 12. It's the same thing. This is called Quatre Soleils, 4 suns, and the suns in this case are these glass discs that are rather shaped like a lens, and they fit into the little cavity there, and there's foil on the back. So when the light hits them, bang, they glow. Just think about that. That's brilliant. It's basically the idea of a jeweler making, in this case, a perfume bottle. Also notice the shape of this vase. It's exactly the same as the shape of this bottle. And what Lalique realized he could do was to take an object that he had designed and make it on any scale he wanted. He had developed, in fact, in the 1890s, a system for doing that. Jewelers do that. They design, if you're making a tiny piece of jewelry, you design it kind of large and then you scale it down using a kind of caliper system to a réduire, it's called in French. And he used the same technique from his very early time in glassmaking to make the same object as a different object on a different scale. Very clever. This perfume bottle, 1911, 12, was not made for Coty or anyone else, even though by this time he had Coty as a big client. He had 2 or 3 other French perfumers as his clients, and within 10 years, he had 25 perfumers all over the world as his clients commissioning bottles from him. But this was made just for him. He started making perfume bottles that were sold empty in his store, together with the other things that he sold, making them at the glassworks in Clairefontaine. Look at this one. This is called Fougère, Ferns, and same technique, exquisite bottle. I mean, this is a commercial perfume bottle. You could walk into a store and buy it full of perfume in 1912, 13, 14. And again, the central panel is done in that technique. It's a simple piece of glass that's set in. That's the front and the back of it. And by the way, these are incredibly cheap to make, you know? You can make them over and over and over again. He figured out how to make the bottle itself, the body of the bottle itself, very inexpensively. It's a vacuum technique. He learned the process basically from wine bottle making, which you make really cheaply. And you make a wine bottle, it's a bottle. If you make the mold decorative, you can make a decorative bottle. He realized that. And if you make a little cavity in the middle, you can stick one of these in and bang, it becomes amazing. There was, I remember his clients at the time, 1912, 13, 14, were primarily jewelry people. So he made perfume bottles that you could wear. Many of the bottles you see upstairs and in this exhibition at Hillwood were designed to carry with you, partly because of the vagaries of the time. You always wanted something nice to smell and to get rid of this and that. That was still the case in 1912, and the pendant perfume, which you wore on a silk cord around your neck, like this blue one here, was very much a sort of tasty thing to have for traveling. So you got this beautiful Lalique ornament that's also practical. And look how good the perfumes get. Most of the Lalique's perfumes are made in clear glass. The one we just saw, let's go back to that. This is clear glass. There's nothing, the glass is not colored. It's stained on the outside with a patina, but everything about this is clear. The medallion is clear, the bottle is clear, it's white clear glass, which is the cheapest glass you can get. The color in the golden color is from the foil inside, and the greenish color is from a patina that's painted on the outside in the sort of manner of Japanese ivory decoration. But he did start making in colored glass. It's a little more expensive to make colored glass. You have to devote a whole kiln to it, a whole day, a whole week, a whole whatever. But he found this was successful. The one on the right, called Amphitrite, he made that in a series of colors. I think that green is arguably the prettiest. Again, made purely for him. The idea being that you had it on the dressing table, it was a decorative thing. If you wanted to put your favorite fragrance in, you could. Another early one, Pavot, shaped like a poppy head. And I want to talk a little about how he made these. So I say, many of them, the simple bottles, if you like, were made just by sucking the glass into a mold. But some of them, you couldn't do that. This one is decorated on the inside as well as the outside, which Lalique put a lot of thought into. It creates a three-dimensional concept that really brings this flower to life. Again, it's clear glass, by the way. The stopper is black, the stamen, but the rest of it is clear, and then it's decorated on the outside. But the only way you could make that is to mold it rather as a cup, if you like, so that it's molded on the inside and the outside. Imagine it's like, turn it upside down, imagine it's like the bowl of a wine glass. And then he applied the base using hot glass technique after the whole thing was molded. So this is cast like a wine bowl, like a wine glass bowl, which you can cast on the inside and the outside. And then he applied that base to it. This was expensive and a little tricky, and he didn't make many of these, but some of the very best Lalique perfume bottles are made that way. This is one of my favorites. It's called panier de fleurs, basket of flowers. It's the same basket that those guys in Grasse used to pick the roses, you know. If you've ever been to Grasse, they still use them, these paniers that they carry around. And this was made entirely without blowing. The glass is forced into the metal mold with a kind of mandrel that pushes it in, creates this great detail, and then the stopper is cast separately. Beautiful thing. 1912-13. This is clear glass, but the pearl on La Perle Noire, the black pearl for Faureville, is just painted. It's just molded, and it's not a full pearl. It's like an eye, if you like, and then it's painted black on the back, so it looks like a black pearl. You know, it's very cheaply made, but again, brilliant design by Lalique. He designed the bottles and the packaging, and a great Lalique bottle has both. He was very good at this technique, whereby he took glass and molded it, as I say, inside and out. To cast a piece of glass with a relief on one side is relatively easy, but Lalique realized that you could cast relief on one side and then what's called intaglio, kind of reverse relief, on the other. And he does it here. Again, we see him as a glassmaker and a jeweler. This is a famous brooch by him called the Kiss sur le Baiser, where he is sticking out in relief and she's inside in intaglio. And here the night and day clock. It's the same concept, where she is night, you know. She's thick glass molded on the back, the front is flat, and he's cast into the glass. So it's the same glass, but it just, the way the light takes it, it's so much darker on the thick part. Same on this bowl with again the moths, the phalène, all through it. And wherever the glass is thickest, it'll opalesce. There he does this that amazing moment in time thing again. That's all one piece of horn. And I love, this is one of my favorites. As Lalique starts making and selling perfume bottles, he starts making all the accessories, the powder boxes and so on that go with it. This little powder box, 1911, has 4 moths on the top. Again, beautifully arranged in symmetry. And if you lift that off, you'll see the bodies of the moths are molded on the inside too. So the moths are completely alive by this. You know, the color in the glass just brings them completely to life. It's a beautiful thing, that is. Simple, beautiful through its simplicity. This is a little Lalique letter seal. By this time he starts adventuring and making all different things in glass. By the 1920s he can make almost anything in glass, but he started making little things, little letter seals and little things for the desk and little other accessories and what have you. More perfumes. This is an early Coty Queue de Chalice, another ugly creature on the top. But this is made too with that applied base because the inside is molded. A bottle for Worth with, you can't see it very well, but that's a butterfly lady on the front. You know, it's one of his mythical creatures has appeared on this. And opalescent glass, but also this deep orange color that Lalique was able to play with, making bottles, especially for his biggest client from about 1920, the Worth Company. Worth Fragrances took him through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. This is an extremely inexpensive bottle, made in the hundreds of thousands, called Vers le Jour. It's really it sort of, to me, it replicates the dawn. It's that dawn light that he's able to make in the cheapest possible glass bottle. Worth fragrances. Dans la nuit, you'll see that bottle upstairs in the few little 20th century pieces that complement the primary exhibit. There's Vers le Jour again. Most of the Worth fragrances are very Art Deco. He designed also the store fronts for Worth. There was a store in Cannes entirely in Lalique glass. Roger et Gallet, another partner and neighbor on the Place Vendome, they're still there actually. He created some of his most elegant bottles for them. They were a little more expensive, you know. They were the good wine, you know. And this is a beautiful one, I think. I'm sure Mrs. Post would have liked this one. Don't know, she must have missed it because she loved the Chinese snuff bottles that this is modeled on. It's made in green glass simulating jade. It's called Le Jade. The red coral, and a simple bottle painted with red enamel. This one is the most expensive commercial fragrance bottle ever. It's called Trésor de la Mer, Treasure from the Sea. It's an opalescent box shaped like a clamshell, and inside it there is a little pearl-shaped bottle. You know, they say, you know, when you buy a perfume, the thing is like this big and you get this much perfume in it. Well, this is pretty good, I'm telling you. You get a tiny bit of perfume and you get this huge presentation. This was made exclusively for Saks Fifth Avenue in 1939, which was not a good year, by the way, because you know, things were not going well and all that. And I have to tell you the story. I actually bought this. I didn't buy it, sorry. I took it to auction from a lady who called me, it was about 15 years ago, lady in New Jersey, and said, I've got this thing, and bought it at Saks Fifth Avenue, and she started to describe it. I said, I know what it is. She said, a local antiques dealer has offered me $200 for it. And I said, I'll take care of it. So I came and I put it in auction for her. She hadn't bought it, her husband had bought it for her in 1939 in Saks Fifth Avenue, and he had paid $25 for it. And the reason he bought it is because it was half price. Because Saks couldn't sell it. It was priced at $50, and they couldn't. Anyway, I sold it for $206,000. So she was very happy. There are very few perfumes like Trésor de la Mer made in opalescent glass. Lalique really reserved that for other things, tableware and vases in particular. This is not a perfume bottle; it's a vase with the two turtle doves on what I've always thought is a big egg, you know. And to me, this is a wedding thing. It's a fertility thing, I think. Beautiful, beautiful object. Only really good in opalescence. And Lalique, by the time he designs this, he's 65 years old, you know. He's not a young man. And yet he's capable of being entirely modern in what he does. Again, he doesn't stay away from the symmetry. He loves the symmetry. He loves birds of all types. And he plays with the opalescent glass. These were cheap. This was a common thing sold at the Paris exhibition of 1925, which is really the next great punctuation mark in René Lalique's history. There is a box that, a perfume object, powder box, in opalescent glass, but it's rare. And again, the dragonflies, at that moment in time again where they overlap, just amazing. They're molded on the inside. The top of the thing is flat, smooth. They're molded on the inside, and they just come to life, don't they? I like the plate next to it that demonstrates his symmetry again. Those are hunting dogs, you see. And by this time, he's moved to a new factory. He opens a new factory in Alsace in 1921. Alsace in the north of France is a region that you may know has kind of been fought between France and Germany for centuries. And after the First War, it goes back to France, and French industry is encouraged by the government to settle there. Lalique takes advantage of that, builds a factory. It's still there. It's where all Lalique is made today. And you can't visit it, but you can visit the Museum of Lalique, which is right nearby, a kilometer away. Well worth a visit. And in Alsace, he can make just about anything, and he starts making much larger things, architectural glass and huge vases, and production goes into overload. Perfume bottles made still in large numbers. He's kind of given up with Coty. He does this by 1920. Coty, as I say, was a very different kind of man, not Lalique's kind of man at all. And Coty builds his own factory to make perfumes, which they do in a massive scale, bigger than Lalique could really do. But Lalique still makes these exquisite things. Some of them were made, boxes were made to complement perfume and eau de toilette bottles. So you could have on your dressing table, you could have the full range of things in the same pattern. What we call garniture de toilette by Lalique. I like this little object. This is a little presentation box of powder made in plastic. And Rene Lalique made this together with 3 other plastic designs in 1924, 5, and 6. He was experimenting with different materials. Cherries, cerise, this is called. They're quite rare, but it's a great little object. And again, evidence that here's a guy in his mid-60s, and he's saying, oh, let's see what else I can do. I'm going to start playing with something different. He also worked in aluminum, which was a very practical material, cheap, easy. And in the machine age of the 20s and 30s, aluminum was a very acceptable material indeed, much more so, arguably, than it is today. So we see a lot of these aluminum powder boxes made for a number of companies. Beautiful thing when you think about it, stamped out. And he did a lot in cardboard. Many of the boxes of the perfumes were made in card, of course, and designed by Lalique. Some of them were in leather also. Here's a cardboard for the silver poppies. It's called pavot d'argent. It's a beautiful little oval powder presentation. But most Lalique bottles, of course, are just clear glass, but they were designed, remember, to hold perfume, this rich, warm, brown liquid. So imagine how much better they look with that inside it. And I'm going to leave you with just 1 or 2 more. You can still buy the one on the right with the little lily of the valley kind of sprouting out of it. But I'll leave you with this, which are 2 of my favorite images of Lalique, again, as a jeweler and as a glassmaker. And they represent the 2 pinnacles of his careers. The brooch, the pendant on the right from 1900, and the statuette, as it's called, Suzanne, closest to me, was shown at the Paris exhibition of 1925 for the first time. 2 exquisite opalescent ladies made by the same guy. All of the glass that Rene Lalique produced in his lifetime is under his name. He designed, we think, almost all of it. And anything that he did not design personally, he okayed. So I'll leave you with that, ladies and gentlemen, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to help. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that he died just as the war had ended, I wanted to know what happened to production during the German occupation. Was there any production at all? Or?
Yeah, there was production. I've actually met several people who were there during the war. The factory did not close. It was the site of fighting. It was close to where the Battle of the Bulge was fought. The Germans occupied the factory. They were driven out by the Americans. They came back. They were driven out again by the Americans, all in 1944. The town of Vingen itself did suffer some damage from American artillery, but the factory did not. It stayed, you know, the local people rely on the factory, and they looked after it. And it basically stayed open with some production. But I remember meeting an American soldier once who was there in 1944 with the American infantry, and he was in the factory, and he bought a few pieces from a guy, you know, that were on the shelf and all that, and he said they were still making things, but obviously in a very limited way. They lost a lot of their ability to make things, and of course their marketplace. But things did keep going.
Was there any rarity to the provenance of pieces made during the German occupation rather than fully French made? No,
not really. No, I mean the occupation was not really occupation. It was you know, Alsace wasn't really occupied in the same way that you know, let's say Vichy France was. So it was no, there's nothing like that.
One more.
Okay.
If Fleur du Temps was created in 1948, how come he died in 1945?
Well, Le Du Temps, all of the work for Le Du Temps and Nina Ricci was by his son, Marc Lalique, who had joined the factory. He joined the company in 1922. He was born in 1900. But Nina Ricci, under Robert Ricci, kind of kept the Lalique company going, actually, through the 50s. But that was all the work of Marc Lalique. All of those Le Du Temps are not Rene Lalique's designs.
The intrinsic value of the boxes versus the item versus the box and the item together, how does that vary?
Well, a lot of collectors, they want the whole thing.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, you want the whole thing, and the whole thing can make it worth 10 times more than just the bottle. But only the commercial bottles had boxes. You know, the bottles that he made for himself to sell in the store empty. There's no box for that. And some commercial bottles have very ordinary looking boxes, but a really great box and a really great presentation can elevate the price enormously.
Were any of the boxes ever signed?
Yeah, some of them. A few, not many. Some of the boxes were signed. That Silver Poppies one is. Okay. Thank you very much.